Under the glittering chandeliers of Boston's most exclusive ballroom, a single name shatters the night. The city's most powerful magnate must choose a noble bride. Yet, in front of stunned aristocrats, he points to a mill girl in a plain dress. Is it a cruel joke, a hidden vendetta, or the beginning of a love he never meant to feel? As whispers turn to scandal, one woman will fight not just for her heart, but for her dignity in a world built to break her. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. And do you believe a period romance is more powerful when love defies class, or when it heals it? Boston, the year of 1890. Snow clung to the edges of cobblestone streets, and gaslight lamps flickered against the silk shadows of Beacon Hill. Inside the Langford Assembly Hall, every crystal chandelier burned with ruthless splendor, reflecting off polished marble and gilded cornices. The air was heavy with perfume, lace, and anticipation. A string quartet murmured in the background, barely heard above the rustling of satin skirts and murmured gossip. The city's aristocracy, railroad heiresses, European countesses, banking dynasties with names older than the Revolution, had gathered not just for charity, but for spectacle. All eyes whispered behind lace fans and champagne flutes were on Charles Pembroke. He stood beneath the grand archway of the ballroom, draped in tailored charcoal wool that fit him with the precision of wealth and habit. His cravat was dark blue silk, his vest embroidered with restraint. He wore no flower in his lapel, no hint of sentimentality. His expression was as unreadable as carved stone, steel blue eyes surveying the room like a battlefield, not a celebration. Everyone knew the reason for the gathering. Whispers of his impending engagement had reached even the houses in Newport and the salons of Paris. The eligible ladies of society, dozens of them, all noble-blooded and meticulously prepared, were adorned like porcelain on display. They watched him with careful smiles, waiting to be named, and among them, entirely out of place, stood Elis Winslow. She was near the far end of the ballroom, beneath a less favored chandelier, her back to the crowd. Her gown, though respectable, bore the simplicity of ready-made fashion. Navy blue wool, trimmed with ivory lace. Too modest for the season, too plain for the company. She wore no jewelry except a narrow silver pin at her throat, a keepsake from her late mother. Her chestnut brown hair had been braided and pinned by a mill friend with trembling fingers. She did not belong there, and she knew it. Elis had received the invitation only 3 days earlier, an accident or perhaps a cruel joke, after winning a charity raffle meant to honor working women. Her forewoman at the textile mill had pushed her to go, arguing that it would be good for the cause. She had come alone, with borrowed gloves and a heart heavy with caution. Her hazel eyes scanned the room with quiet wariness, taking in the silks, the hauteur, the unnatural stillness in the faces of women who had never known hunger. And then Charles Pembroke moved. He stepped onto the raised dais near the orchestra and raised his gloved hand. A hush spread through the hall like frost over glass. Conversations halted. The conductor paused mid-bow. Even the chandeliers seemed to still. Charles's voice was calm, firm, and unmistakably cold. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this evening, in gratitude to those who have shaped the fortunes of our city, I am pleased to make a personal announcement." A ripple of excitement coursed through the crowd. Fans fluttered, mothers leaned forward, one countess gripped her daughter's wrist, but Charles's gaze did not turn to them, it turned to the far end of the room, to her. "Elis Winslow," he said, his voice carrying with deadly clarity, "has accepted my invitation to become my fiancée." The room shattered. It did not explode in noise. It fractured into stunned silence. Then, like thunder delayed after lightning, came the gasps. A laugh from one corner quickly hushed. A clink of glass dropped from trembling fingers. The noblewomen, painted and poised, stared as if a stable girl had been crowned queen. Elis did not move. Her breath froze in her throat. The sound of her name, spoken from that height, felt like a slap made public. Her mind reeled, searching for meaning. She had never spoken to him, never even stood in the same room before tonight. Charles watched her without expression. It was not admiration in his gaze. It was strategy. The nobles turned to look at her as though she were not a woman, but a spectacle, an insult, a message. Elis's body felt rigid with shame, her hands trembling within her gloves. From the edge of her vision, she saw one gentleman sneer behind his monocle. A lady in pale pink whispered behind a lace fan, her voice slicing like a ribbon of contempt. But it was the faintest flicker of a smile on Charles's lips that broke her. He had meant it. Not the proposal, but the humiliation. He had used her to make a mockery of them all, and she was the blade. She turned, slowly, deliberately. Her boots echoed on the marble floor as she walked through the parted sea of silks and whispers, head held high, cheeks burning. No one stopped her. No one called her name. Outside, the air was bitter with winter. Snow fell lightly on the steps of the Langford Assembly Hall as Elis stepped into the cold without a coat. Her shawl was thin, her pride thinner still. But she walked without pause, boots cracking the frost, eyes forward. Her father had once told her, "Never let them laugh at you for free. If they want to use you, make them regret it." Inside, the music resumed. The next waltz began. The city danced. But from that night onward, all of Boston would remember her name. Elis Winslow, the factory girl who was named bride in a ballroom of queens. The snow had not melted in 3 days. It clung to rooftops like brittle lace, turning the wide avenues of Boston into a portrait of frozen elegance. Carriages creaked along icy cobblestones, their wheels muffled by slush, and chimney smoke curled into the pale morning like whispered secrets. The city, still reeling from the scandalous announcement at the Langford Assembly Hall, buzzed with speculation. Yet Elis Winslow moved through it unnoticed. Just another working girl clutching a borrowed shawl and a letter sealed in wax. The envelope bore the unmistakable crest of Pembroke & Sons. Her name had been written with practiced strokes, as though the pen itself disapproved of her. Inside, a note of few words but heavy meaning, an invitation, not to tea nor to apology, but to discuss terms. Her forewoman, a kind but fearful woman named Mrs. Larkin, had been the first to see it. She paled and set down her ledger before turning to Elis with shaking hands. "They'll ruin us if you refuse," she whispered, her voice breaking like dry paper. "You may not have wanted this, but child, we've all seen what happens to women who defy men like Charles Pembroke." Elis said nothing. She did not trust her voice. That morning she dressed in silence, choosing a plain wool dress in storm grey, a colour that felt neither submissive nor proud. Her boots were scuffed but clean. She braided her hair into a simple coil and pinned it tightly, as though daring the wind to loosen her. Inside her satchel, tucked between layers of cotton, lay a small, pressed violet, faded, brittle, and unspeakably precious. Her mother's favourite flower, a memory of spring when all the world had still made sense. Beneath it was a folded scrap of paper, stained with time. Her father's handwriting, strong and angular. "You are not to be used, not for favour, not for pride, not for survival." La Dame, by the time the Pembroke carriage arrived at the boarding house, Elis had already made her decision. She would walk into the lion's den, but she would walk on her own 2 feet. Pembroke Manor rose like a stone monument at the end of Mount Vernon Street, its facade severe and symmetrical, its windows staring blankly like the eyes of a judge. The driver said nothing as he helped her down, and the butler who answered the door regarded her as one might a package left on the steps by mistake. He led her through cold corridors lined with portraits, faces of Pembroke's past, each more humorless than the last. Elis walked with measured steps, her gaze forward, her fingers curled tightly inside her gloves. In the drawing room, winter sunlight spilled through tall windows, revealing the rich textures of damask wallpaper and carved mahogany. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it gave no warmth. Margaret Pembroke sat at the far end of the room, like a throne had been built around her. Her silver-grey hair was arranged in a braided crown, her gown the colour of garnets, fitted with unforgiving precision. She did not rise to greet Elis. "You're punctual," she said, her voice clipped and cool. "That is a virtue, rare these days." Elis curtsied, not out of deference, but because her mother had once said, "Even lions blink when faced with grace." "I was summoned," she replied evenly. "I came because it seemed necessary." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Your presence has complicated matters. My son's announcement has, predictably, stirred the press, but it is the investors who concern me. Charles will need to proceed, at least in appearances, until the storm passes." "And then what?" Elis asked. Margaret's gaze sharpened. "Then we all resume our rightful places." Before Elis could answer, another figure entered the room. Beatrice Pembroke, tall and slender, with the fragile elegance of someone raised to be looked at rather than heard. She wore a pale lavender tea-gown, her light brown hair gathered in soft pinned waves. Her expression, though guarded, lacked cruelty. "You must be Miss Winslow," she said, with a voice like wind through silk. "I'm Beatrice." Elis nodded. "Pleased to meet you." Beatrice glanced at her mother, then added softly, "I hope you'll allow me to show you to your rooms." Margaret stood. "1 month. You will dine when asked, smile when spoken to. No mention of arrangements outside these walls. We expect discretion." Elis straightened her spine. "And in return—" Margaret paused. "You will be afforded protection, silence, a place to vanish when this is over." Elis's eyes did not flinch. "I have no intention of vanishing." Margaret turned and swept from the room like a departing storm. Upstairs, the manor's grandeur continued in velvet drapes and inlaid wood. Beatrice led her to a guest suite, lavish by any standard, but strangely sterile, as though no soul had ever truly lived in it. "The housekeeper will have something prepared for you," Beatrice said, setting a key on the writing desk. "Her name is Ellen. She's kind. She'll help you find your way." Elis hesitated. "And you?" Beatrice blinked, surprised. "Me? Are you kind?" A pause, then a faint smile. "I try to be. But sometimes I'm afraid I'm only obedient." Their eyes met, not as rivals, but as women caught in the same golden trap. Later, while the hallways darkened and the bells of the city tolled 5, Ellen Keating knocked gently on Elis's door. She was a stout woman in her 50s, with a linen apron, a gentle face, and hands that smelled faintly of lavender and starch. "I've drawn a bath and laid out some things," she said. "Nothing fancy, but clean and warm." Elis turned to her. "Thank you, for not looking at me like I'm a ghost." Ellen chuckled softly. "Oh, child, this house has had ghosts aplenty. You're the first living thing I've seen walk in with fire still in her eyes." Elis swallowed a lump in her throat. "I don't want to be here." "I believe you," Ellen said, her voice like wool against stone. "But you're here, so make them remember you were." When the door closed, Elis sat alone at the edge of the bed. The fire flickered against the embroidered drapes. On the writing desk lay a folded sheet of stationery. She retrieved the violet from her satchel, unfolded the small paper from her father, and placed both beside the inkwell. She would not become someone else's pawn, but she would learn the rules of the game. And in the quiet of the lion's den, she began to plan not how to survive, but how to endure with her dignity unbroken. The Pembroke household awoke each morning with mechanical precision, like the gears of the city's grandest clock tower. Servants glided through the corridors before dawn, unseen and silent, lighting fires, polishing brass, preparing breakfast trays on silver warmed by steam. Elis Winslow, however, was not used to living among people who moved like whispers. The quiet unnerved her more than noise ever had. Her new garments, chosen and laid out by Ellen each morning, were modest by society's standards, yet far finer than anything Elis had ever owned. The fabric was soft wool dyed in muted tones, plum, slate, pine green, No corset bones bruised her ribs, but every hem, every button felt like a borrowed breath. The high collars framed her neck with propriety, while long sleeves cloaked the calluses on her hands, hands that were not meant for parlour rooms or porcelain teacups. On her third morning in the manor, Elis stood before the full-length mirror in her chamber, fastening the final hook of a dove-grey dress trimmed in ivory ribbon. The morning light filtered through sheer curtains, casting pale gold across her reflection. She stared at herself, at the unfamiliar silhouette she now wore, and wondered, not for the first time, what it meant to be seen by the world through a costume not of her choosing. Downstairs, the day unfolded with elegance sharpened by expectation. Margaret Pembroke's footsteps echoed in measured rhythm. Beatrice floated through the halls with practiced grace, offering gentle smiles that never quite reached her eyes. Charles Pembroke, when he appeared, brought with him an aura that silenced even the grandfather clock in the east hallway. He was always impeccably dressed, always precise in movement and word. His presence filled the space, yet it left Elis colder than absence. At the breakfast table, they sat like carved figures. Margaret at one end, Charles at the other, Elis placed somewhere in between like a misaligned chess piece. The silence at meals was not peaceful, it was oppressive. Forks touched fine china with delicate precision, but no one spoke unless necessity dictated. The few words Charles offered her were curt, formal, and spoken without lifting his eyes. Once, she glanced toward him, searching for a hint of recognition. But his expression was unreadable, like frost over a mirror. Beatrice, sensing the tension, tried her best to fill the void. That morning, she invited Elis to accompany her to a luncheon hosted by the St. Botolph Ladies' Circle, a charity organization composed of Boston's most polished matrons and their carefully groomed daughters. "It will be good for you," Beatrice said, adjusting the pearl pin at her collar. "They will be curious, of course. But curiosity fades faster than silence." Elis said nothing. She was already learning the weight of silence. The carriage ride to the luncheon passed in quiet companionship. Beatrice spoke of mundane things, the fall of lace fashion, a cousin's engagement, the new pianist at the conservatory. Elis listened, her hands folded in her lap, her thoughts drifting to the factory floor, to Nora, to the smell of raw cotton and the rhythm of needle against thread. The venue, a grand townhouse lined with tall, arched windows and floral wallpapers, was filled with laughter too sweet to be sincere. Women in pastel gowns adorned with feathers and seed pearls turned their heads the moment Elis entered. Their eyes lingered on her hem, her posture, her hands, her every breath. The greetings were polite but barbed. "My dear Miss Pembroke," cooed a woman in rose silk, "you've brought such a fascinating guest. How delightful to finally meet a real woman of the people," another chimed in. "You must tell us, Miss Winslow, do you prefer coal or gaslight? I've heard mill houses are so particular." Elis met each comment with quiet resolve. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch, but beneath the surface her pride trembled. One girl, no older than 20, leaned forward with a practiced smile. "And tell me, do you truly plan to wed Mr. Pembroke, or is it merely a passing arrangement?" Elis set down her teacup. "I imagine you're more interested in what he plans." The girl blinked, stunned into momentary silence. Beatrice coughed delicately into her napkin to disguise a smile. Later, when they returned to the manor, Elis retreated to the music room, a forgotten chamber at the rear of the house, where dust still clung to the corners and the piano stood slightly out of tune. It was there, beneath fading afternoon light, that she let herself breathe. She did not weep, she did not break, she sang. It was an old melody, nothing grand, just a lullaby her mother used to hum while folding linens at dusk. Her voice was soft, untrained, carrying through the air like smoke rising from embers. The room warmed with memory as the words left her lips. She did not know that Charles stood in the hallway just beyond the open door. He had come seeking solitude. What he found instead was a voice that did not belong in marble halls, a sound that stirred something within him he could not name. He remained still, his hands in his pockets, his jaw tight. The song spoke of rain, of waiting, of violets blooming too late. It made the silence that followed unbearable. That night at dinner, he said her name, only once. "Elis." She looked up, startled. "You sang today?" Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Yes." A long silence. "You shouldn't do it where others might hear." The words landed like ice dropped into fire. Margaret raised a brow. Beatrice frowned slightly. Elis lowered her gaze, not in shame, but in restraint. "I wasn't aware it was forbidden," she said, her voice even. "It's not forbidden," Charles replied too quickly. "It's just unexpected." Elis looked at him fully then. Her eyes were steady, her chin lifted. "Perhaps, Mr. Pembroke, you've surrounded yourself too long with expectations." Neither spoke again for the remainder of the meal. Outside, the wind had picked up. Boston braced for another storm, and so did the girl who now lived beneath a roof that had never been meant to shelter her heart. The next morning, Ellen brought word from the mill. "Nora stopped by," she said as she helped Elis fasten her cuffs. "The girls are worried. There's talk of hours being cut. Hargrave has been sniffing around." Elis's fingers froze. "He's threatening them. He's punishing them. Through you." Elis's throat tightened. She turned to the window, watching the pale snow drift over the iron gate. "Tell Nora," she said quietly. "I haven't forgotten where I come from, and I won't let them pay for a place I never asked to stand in." But deep down she knew. The cost of visibility was never hers alone to carry. In the city's finest drawing rooms, her name was already being pulled apart like thread from a hem. In the mills, her silence echoed louder than any machine. And in the Pembroke household, where even kindness came wrapped in caution, she was learning that silk could burn just as cruelly as salt. The invitation arrived on a silver tray, delivered not by words but by gesture, a folded card, embossed with the Pembroke seal, placed beside her breakfast plate as though it were a matter of routine. Elis stared at it in silence, her hands resting lightly on the linen napkin, her pulse echoing louder than the ticking of the parlour clock. Beatrice sat across from her, stirring her tea, her eyes fixed on the pale morning beyond the frost-glazed windows. She said nothing, but her stillness betrayed a quiet alertness, as if she too waited for Elis's response. Charles did not dine with them that morning. Elis reached for the card. The script was precise, cool, undeniably his. "Miss Winslow, your presence is requested this evening at the quarterly dinner with Pembroke and Sons partners, to be held at 8 o'clock in the main dining room. Attire, formal. Respectfully, Charles Pembroke." There was no warmth in the words, no invitation, only expectation. That evening Ellen helped her into a gown of midnight blue, chosen from the collection Beatrice had quietly provided over the past weeks. It was simple but elegant, high-collared with delicate lace at the sleeves and a narrow velvet ribbon cinching the waist. Elis wore no jewellery, save for the silver pin that had belonged to her mother. Her hair was gathered into a low chignon, pinned with care, the look of a woman shaped to be seen, but not heard. When she entered the dining room, the conversation halted for half a breath. The partners of Pembroke and Sons were all men of wealth and ambition, their temples dusted with grey, their eyes sharp with calculation. Their wives, seated at their sides, wore gowns threaded with gold, their expressions polished to reflect only approval or disdain, never anything in between. Charles stood at the head of the long table, his posture impeccable, his face unreadable. "Miss Winslow," he said, gesturing to the chair prepared for her halfway down the table. "You are most welcome." Elis inclined her head, neither grateful nor meek. She walked the length of the table under 100 watchful eyes and took her seat without flinching. But inside, something twisted, as if every step on the Persian rug had scraped against her pride. The meal unfolded with ceremonial elegance. Silverware danced, crystal chimed, and the air grew thick with the perfume of pheasant glazed in port and veiled contempt. The conversation was peppered with economic forecasts, transatlantic ventures, and subtle barbs directed at the woman whose presence disturbed the symmetry of the room. A lady in emerald silk turned to Elis with a smile as polished as her diamonds. "Miss Winslow, I hear your voice graced the halls last week. Do you sing professionally, or is it a personal indulgence?" Elis lifted her glass. "It was a lullaby. My mother's voice once carried through mine. No profession, just memory." The lady's smile faltered, but the next one sharpened her tone. "Ah, how touching. Charles, you've always had a talent for discovering rare treasures." Elis felt the words slice beneath her skin, but she held her expression steady. Charles did not respond. Later, when the port was poured and cigars lit, she stood to excuse herself, citing a headache with all the dignity she could muster. No one tried to stop her. They had had their show. In the kitchen, warmth greeted her like a forgotten friend. The scent of bread and rosemary filled the air, and the soft clatter of pots reminded her of something far more real than crystal and silk. Ellen stood by the hearth, her sleeves rolled up, hands dusted with flour. Elis didn't speak. She walked to the table and sat down, her back trembling under the weight she had carried for too long. Her fingers curled into the edge of the wood, and then, like a thread snapped too tight, she broke. Silent tears slid down her cheeks, not dramatic, not loud, just salt against skin, one after the other. Ellen approached, said nothing, and simply placed a hand on her shoulder. Her touch was warm, steady, human. "I didn't cry in front of them," Elis whispered, "but I wanted to." "You're not made of stone, girl," Ellen replied softly, "and even marble can crack." Elis closed her eyes, her voice barely a breath. "Why does he do it? Why parade me in front of people who wish I'd vanish?" The kitchen door creaked behind them. Charles stood there. His coat was still buttoned, his cravat slightly loosened as if he had rushed after her without thought. His gaze met hers across the room, and for the first time in days he didn't look through her, but at her. Ellen stepped away without a word, disappearing into the pantry like a shadow that knew when to retreat. Charles crossed the room slowly. The firelight flickered against his features, softening edges that had always seemed carved in judgment. He stopped a few feet from her, his hands clasped behind his back. "You were not meant to feel humiliated," he said. She laughed, bitter and low. "No, that's fortunate, because I did." He hesitated. "You carry yourself well. I carry what you place on my shoulders." He looked away for a moment, as if the words had pierced something deeper than pride. "You could leave," he said. "You're not a prisoner." Elis rose, slowly, deliberately. Her eyes met his with quiet fire. "I stay," she said, "to protect what you've already damaged. Not for you, for the girls at the mill, for the ones whose names you don't even know but who suffer just by watching me stand beside you." His jaw tensed. "You think I don't see what it costs you?" he murmured. "No," she said. "I think you refuse to understand." A long silence followed. The fire crackled, filling the space between them with shifting shadows. He took a step closer, but stopped himself. His hand hovered slightly, as if reaching for something he did not dare to touch. "Elis," he said, softer now, her name a confession on his tongue. "You were never meant to be part of this." "I was never meant to be used," she replied. And then, without waiting for an answer, she walked past him and left the kitchen, her footsteps light but unwavering. That night, in the stillness of her chamber, Elis sat at the writing desk by the window. The journal lay open before her, its pages blank but heavy with what could not be spoken aloud. She took her pen and began to write, not for anyone else, but for herself. She wrote of anger, of confusion, of moments when his eyes softened and her own chest ached. She wrote of the shame she refused to let swallow her, and of the violet flower still pressed between two pages, untouched yet ever present. When she finished, she folded the paper and tucked it inside the journal beside the violet. She would not send the letter. Some truths lived more safely in silence. Outside, the snow had begun again, delicate as lace. Beatrice stood in the hallway beyond Elis's door, her back against the wall, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She had seen the way Charles looked at her. She had heard the weight in Elis's voice. And for the first time, Beatrice wondered whether the world she had been raised to protect was truly worth the sacrifices it demanded. The wind that swept across Beacon Hill that morning carried something colder than winter. Uncertainty. A grey mist hovered over the rooftops like smoke from a dying fire, and the cobbled streets gleamed damp beneath the wheels of carriages that passed without haste, without joy. Boston's elite moved quietly through the day, their voices lowered in drawing rooms, their eyes sharp over morning papers. At Pembroke Manor, silence was no longer a comfort, it was a warning. In the vast study at the rear of the estate, Charles Pembroke stood before the hearth, unreadable as always, though the flame behind him flickered with agitation. In his hand he held the latest edition of the Boston Herald, the ink still smelling fresh. The article on the front page, framed with theatrical flourish, bore a headline so brazen it seemed designed to cut rather than inform. From loom to lace, the scandalous origins of Boston's most unlikely fiancé. Beneath the title, in paragraphs bloated with innuendo, lay a vicious fabrication that Elis Winslow's mother, a woman long dead and defenseless, had once lived under an assumed name as a courtesan in a Connecticut port town. The claim was bolstered by a misleading trail, a distant cousin with the same surname, a tangle of poor records, and the eager malice of those determined to dismantle her rise. Charles's hands clenched around the paper. Behind him, Margaret Pembroke entered the room unannounced, draped in the black velvet, her presence as deliberate as a bell toll. "It's already circulating at the club," she said. "Lady Chiltern fainted over her oysters." Charles didn't turn. "Then perhaps she ought to eat fewer oysters. She's threatening to withdraw her daughter's dowry from the railway fund." He let the paper drop to the floor. "She was never part of my decision," he said. Margaret's voice grew colder. "But Elis was, and this is what your pride has purchased." He said nothing, but in his silence was fury, directed at Hargrave, at the press, at the rotting structures of power he had once thought himself wise enough to manipulate. In the parlour, Elis sat in a chair far too elegant for comfort, her eyes fixed on the crack between two floorboards. Ellen, quiet as always, had just delivered the news. The scandal had reached the factories, rumours had spread like spilled oil. Her face remained impassive, but her fingers twisted a handkerchief until the seams threatened to tear. "Are you all right?" Ellen asked softly. Elis looked up, her eyes dry but shining with something deeper than tears. "It's not the lie that hurts," she murmured. "It's that they made her into something shameful." "Your mother?" Elis nodded. "She scrubbed floors until her hands bled. She gave up every comfort so I'd never have to bow. And now they've painted her as—" Her voice broke. "I don't care what they say about me. But she never asked for any of this." Ellen's heart tightened, but there was nothing to say that could undo such cruelty. Moments later, Charles appeared, his steps heavy, his face storm-dark. He paused at the doorway, hands behind his back, eyes fixed not on her, but somewhere past the curtain. "We need to talk," he said. Elis stood, her spine straight. "Do we?" He walked forward, placing the Herald on the table between them. "Do you know this name?" he asked, pointing to the article's mention of a Clara Winslow in New Haven. "No," Elis replied immediately. "And even if I did, it would not matter. She was not my mother." "Are you sure?" he pressed. She stared at him, incredulous. "You think I've lied to you?" Charles's jaw tightened. "I think I've staked my name, my business, and my family's legacy on someone I know very little about. And now—" "Now what?" she snapped. "Now that you're being judged for lifting someone like me into your world." His voice rose, not in volume but in heat. "I am being dissected, Elis." Every deal I've built is shaking on its foundations. Investors are retreating, shares are sliding, and you, I, her eyes flared. What about me, Charles? I'm the one they're tearing apart. Not you, not Margaret, not your silk-skinned guests who sneer behind their gloves. Me. He stepped closer, breath uneven. You could have told me. Told you what? She shot back. That people like Hargrave will twist anything to destroy what they fear, that the poor don't come with pedigrees, that grief leaves no proof. I needed the truth, and I needed respect. A silence snapped between them like a whip. Then, without warning, Elis lifted her hand and struck him. Not hard enough to injure, but enough to silence. Charles blinked, stunned, not by the pain, but by the clarity of it. Elis's voice was low, trembling with fury. I never asked to be chosen. You dragged me into this, and now you accuse me of not being clean enough for your world. Then wash your own hands, Mr. Pembroke. She turned and walked out. He did not follow. That afternoon, Elis returned to the Mill District for the first time since the scandal. The neighborhood had not changed. It still smelled of coal and soap, of iron and wood and resolve. But eyes followed her now, some wide with admiration, others narrowed in suspicion. Inside the factory, Nora Flynn ran to her and embraced her with a force that nearly broke the air. They've been talking nonsense, Nora said, but we don't believe them. Not the girls. Not me. Elis pressed her forehead against her friend's shoulder, a breath escaping her that sounded too close to a sob. They're saying they might cut the second shift, Nora whispered. They say it's because of you. Because Hargrave's threatening to pull contracts. Elis pulled back, her voice hollow. Of course he is. You can't fix it all, Nora warned. No, Elis said, but I won't let them pay for my silence. She spent hours there, walking among the women, listening, thanking them for standing by her. But with each conversation, the weight grew heavier. These were not just co-workers, they were lives. Women with children, widows with no other income, girls barely older than 15, and because of her name, because of the headlines, their work hung in the balance. That night, Elis returned to Pembroke Manor as the sky burned into dusk. The gaslights glowed dimly in the drawing room, where Beatrice sat alone, a book open in her lap, unread. When Elis entered, Beatrice looked up. I read the article, she said quietly. It was vile. I've lived worse, Elis replied. I'm not sure I have, Beatrice confessed. Her voice was fragile, like silk torn down the middle. I used to believe that if one played by society's rules, one would be safe. Elis met her eyes. And now? Beatrice closed the book. Now I believe the game was never fair, only that some of us were too privileged to notice. In the silence that followed, the weight of silk and shadow pressed against every wall, and Elis knew the war had only just begun. The boarding house on Tremont Street was no place for ceremony. Its floorboards creaked with every footstep, and the wallpaper peeled like old memories. The women who lived there spoke in whispers and carried their burdens in woven baskets and in the corners of their eyes. There was no silver, no lace, no pretense, only the clatter of teacups, the smell of coal smoke, and the quiet endurance of the forgotten. Elis Winslow had taken refuge in the smallest of the upstairs rooms, a narrow space with a slanted ceiling and a single window that looked out onto the fog-wrapped roofs of Boston. She had brought little with her when she left Pembroke Manor, only a satchel with 2 dresses, a worn book of poetry, and a journal whose pages now bore ink-stained truths too dangerous to speak aloud. She sat beside the window that evening, her hands folded on her lap, the violet flower still pressed between the leaves of her book. She had not yet found the strength to throw it away. It was too fragile, too beautiful, too tied to everything she wished to remember and forget. A knock came at the door, 3 slow taps, uncertain, unmistakable. She rose and opened it. Charles Pembroke stood on the threshold, the hallway behind him dim and smelling faintly of boiled cabbage and mothballs. He was out of place, absurdly so. His coat was tailored, his boots polished, his gloved hands holding his hat like a man, unsure whether he had come to ask for forgiveness or for permission. "Elis," he said. She did not move aside. "You're not expected." "I know. You're not wanted." "I know that too." She said nothing, only watched him with eyes no longer wide with awe or hope, but narrowed by experience. He shifted slightly, uncomfortable in the narrow corridor. "I came because this has gone too far," he said. "There are threats now. Rumors spreading faster than I can contain them, and not just about you." She raised an eyebrow. "About you, then. That's what brings you here." His gaze tightened. "About the mill. About your friends. Your grave has influence where I didn't think he did." A pause. She let the silence stretch, not as cruelty, but as caution. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he added. A bitter smile touched her lips. "You didn't mean to feel anything at all." He looked down. For the first time in days, the armor around him faltered. "I have no excuse," he said. "But I do have an offer." "Another transaction," she murmured. "I'm asking you to come back, temporarily, not as a performance, not as a fiancé, but as a guest under my protection." She tilted her head slightly. "And what does that protection look like, Charles? Another dinner where they sneer behind crystal. Another headline where my mother is dragged through the mud for being born in the wrong house." His voice dropped, quiet but sincere. "It means I'll make the press stop. I'll speak publicly. I'll name Hargrave. I'll burn every bridge I must." She folded her arms. "And why now?" He hesitated. "Because I finally realized what I'm protecting, and who I failed to protect." Her chest rose and fell slowly, the only outward sign of the war unfolding inside her. Then she stepped back. "Come in." He entered, ducking slightly beneath the low frame. The room was small, plain, and carried the scent of lavender and old books. There was nowhere for him to sit that wouldn't make him look too large, too well-formed for the space. She didn't offer him tea. She didn't pretend this was a reconciliation. She stood before him, arms still crossed. "What are your terms?" she asked. "No terms. Only this. Come back so that I can shield you from what I let happen. And when it's over, you leave if you wish, or stay, but on your terms." The honesty in his voice struck her harder than any insult ever had. She studied him, watched the way his fingers trembled slightly, how his jaw tightened, not in arrogance, but in restraint. "There's a condition," she said. He met her gaze. "Name it. You tell the papers the truth, that you chose me for mockery, that you lifted me to humiliate others, and that you regret it." His throat bobbed. "Done. And you will make it clear that my mother, Marianne Winslow, was nothing but decent, that she worked, that she died with dignity." "I will," he said without hesitation. Elis inhaled slowly. "Then I will return." His shoulders dropped slightly, relief mingling with guilt. "But don't expect a smile," she added. "Don't expect me to walk beside you. I'm not there for you. I'm there for the girls losing their wages, and for the name I still carry." He nodded once. That night, Charles left the boarding house alone, the cold air biting through his coat, but something warmer flickering inside his chest. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps the seed of it. When Elis returned to Pembroke Manor the next morning, she did not enter through the servants' door. She walked up the main steps, her head high, her gloves clean, her eyes dry. The butler looked momentarily confused, but stepped aside without question. Beatrice met her at the landing, a soft expression of welcome in her eyes. "I'll help you unpack," she said gently. They walked together to the guest suite, where sunlight streamed through the lace curtains and the fireplace had already been lit. Beatrice took the satchel and laid it gently on the bed. "No one here will speak of it again," she said. "The article, your mother." "I don't need their silence," Elis replied, "only their distance." Beatrice looked at her for a long moment. "You've changed." Elis allowed herself a faint smile. "No, I've simply stopped apologizing." Later that evening, alone in her room, Elis lit a single candle and took the newspaper clipping from where she had hidden it inside the desk. Her hands didn't shake. Her eyes didn't water. She held the article to the flame and watched as it curled inward, blackening at the edges until only ashes remained. Then she opened her book, the one with the violet flower. It was still there, still fragile, still untouched. She placed it gently between fresh pages, not to forget, but to remember differently. Downstairs, Charles passed the drawing room and paused. He saw her silhouette from the hallway, standing by the window, candlelight behind her, hair unbound from its usual coil. She wasn't looking at anything in particular, but she stood with the stillness of someone who knew who she was again. And for the first time, Charles did not see her as a disruption or a scandal. He saw her as a mirror, and in her quiet defiance, he saw everything he had once lost in himself. The storm arrived without mercy. By dusk, the windows of Pembroke Manor were glazed with frost so thick it blurred the world beyond into a pale watercolor of snow and shadows. The wind howled through the chimney flues, rattling shutters and whispering down the halls like voices of the dead. Servants moved quickly and quietly, stacking logs near hearths and tightening curtains to keep the bitter air at bay. Even the clocks ticked slower, as if weighed down by the cold. Inside the manor, a strange stillness settled, one not born of peace, but of isolation. The city was unreachable. Carriages were frozen in their stables, letters undelivered. The great house, for all its wealth and elegance, had become a prison of velvet and marble, and in one of its salons, lit only by the orange glow of a fire and the soft flicker of gaslight sconces, Elis Winslow sat in an armchair, too ornate for comfort, wrapped in a wool shawl, her hair loose for the first time in weeks. She stared into the flames, her face illuminated in hues of gold and shadow, her expression unreadable. She had not meant to stay in this room. She had wandered through the house like a ghost at twilight, restless, unable to sleep. Her feet had carried her here without thought, drawn by the warmth, by the solitude, by something unnamed and uninvited. She did not know he was already there. Charles Pembroke stood in the far corner, his tall figure half concealed in the dim light, a glass of brandy in one hand, his cravat loosened, his gaze distant. He had been there long enough to hear her footsteps, to recognize them. He had not spoken. Perhaps he had hoped she would turn and leave. Perhaps he had hoped she wouldn't. Now, in the hush between firelight and silence, their eyes met. Elis didn't startle. She didn't stand. She simply looked at him, and he saw in her expression not fear, not anger, but something heavier, expectation. "Should I go?" she asked. His voice, when it came, was low. "No." He crossed the room slowly, each step echoing faintly in the fire-warmed space. He did not sit. Instead, he stood before the hearth, the brandy untouched, his gaze on the flames. "They used to call me a mongrel," he said. Elis blinked. "Who?" "Their fathers. The men I do business with now. The ones who signed contracts with my name but once spit at my shoes." His mouth tightened. "My father was born in the back room of a stonemason shop. He built houses he was never allowed to live in. When he died, he left us nothing but grit. My mother taught me that Polish was something a man could learn, but blood couldn't lie." Elis watched him, unsure of what to say. The flickering light danced across his face, softening the hard lines etched there by years of restraint. "I came back from school at 17, he continued, wearing a suit that didn't fit and a name I hadn't earned. I was mocked. Not for my ideas, but for the way I held my fork, for the calluses still on my hands, for not knowing how to pretend I was better than the street I'd been raised on." Elis's voice was quiet. "So you learned to pretend louder than the rest." His eyes found hers. Yes. A long silence settled between them. Outside, the wind moaned through the cracks in the window panes, but inside, the fire grew steady. She rose, moving to stand across from him, the hearth between them like a glowing confession box. "And when you chose me?" she asked. When you humiliated me in front of all of Boston, was that your revenge? His shoulders tensed. He looked down at his brandy, then set it on the mantelpiece. It was, he said, not against you, but against them. I wanted to remind them that everything they called noble could be shaken by one girl in a plain dress. Her breath caught. The admission landed like a stone in deep water. "And did you expect me to be silent?" she asked, her voice laced with restrained fury. "To smile? To play the fool while they tore my past to pieces?" "No," he said. "I didn't expect you at all." The tension hung between them, thick as smoke. Elis wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "My father died when I was 10. He was a foreman, never educated but proud. He taught me to read by candlelight, to write in the margins of grocery lists, to never lower my voice in a room full of men." Charles listened, unmoving. "After he died," she continued, "I worked. My mother wept quietly in the kitchen every night for 6 months. And then one day she stopped. She took in laundry, mended buttons, stood all day on sore feet. She never complained. She just worked. And when she died, I promised myself I would never be like her, never invisible, never used." Her voice broke slightly. "But then you used me anyway." The air crackled, not with fire, but with pain too deep to name. Charles stepped closer. Not so near as to touch her, but close enough that she could feel the gravity of him, the warmth he carried like a secret. "I know," he whispered, "and I am sorry." The words were not grand, not polished, not dramatic, but they were real. Elis looked up, eyes shining, her hands trembling. "You humiliated me, Charles, but worse, you made me doubt myself." "I know," he said again, his voice hoarse, "and I will carry that." She turned slightly, her breath uneven. Her hand brushed the mantel, fingers curling around the edge like a woman steadying herself at the edge of a cliff. And still, they did not touch. They only looked, truly looked, and in that gaze something long buried stirred, not desire, not yet, but recognition, of pain shared, of loneliness mirrored, of walls beginning to crack. Then, as the fire dimmed and the storm screamed beyond the glass, another sound cut through the silence. Footsteps, sharp, measured, familiar. Margaret Pembroke entered the room like a blade unsheathed, her dark skirts sweeping the floor, her expression carved from cold porcelain. Charles straightened. Elis turned, the tension in her spine visible. Margaret said nothing to Elis. Her gaze went straight to her son. "I need a word," she said. Charles didn't move. "In private." Elis looked at him, then stepped away. He reached out as if to stop her, but she shook her head. "I know," she said. "I'll go." She left the room, her shawl trailing behind her like smoke. Margaret waited until the door clicked shut, then faced her son with the full weight of her disapproval. "This ends now," she said. "You've played your game. You've made your point. But if you continue with her, if you drag this family further into scandal, you will do so without my name, without my fortune, without anything." Charles did not flinch. "She is beneath you," Margaret added, voice like ice cracking. "You owe your future more than this." He took a breath, slow and steady. "No," he said, "I owe her more than that." Margaret stared at him, and for the first time in his life, Charles did not shrink from her judgment. He let the fire burn, even if it consumed the house. The morning of the inquiry dawned bitter and blue, the kind of cold that clung to breath and bones alike. Boston streets, though free of snow, were coated in frost and suspicion. It was the talk of every tea table, every barbershop, every law office. Elis Winslow, the mill girl who had defied the order of things, was to stand before a committee of men who had already decided who she was. The venue chosen for the hearing was not a courtroom, but it might as well have been. The Boston Merchants' Assembly Hall, a building meant for debates on tariffs and trade, had been transformed into a theatre of judgment. The walls, adorned with oil portraits of pale men with colder eyes, bore silent witness to the day's proceedings. Spectators filled every seat. Some leaned forward with anticipation, others with contempt. And in the center, beneath a tall brass chandelier, stood the woman they had come to see fall. Elis sat alone at a long oak table, her back straight, her dress a muted brown wool with a white collar that framed her face like a question left unanswered. Her hands rested calmly on her lap. She wore no jewelry, no ornament, only the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that appearance was both armor and illusion. At the far end of the room, behind a narrow wooden railing, Charles Pembroke stood with fists clenched at his sides, watching, waiting. His presence was not invited but tolerated, as if his name, too, had lost its former immunity. The chairman of the inquiry, a man named Mr. Alcott, cleared his throat. "We are gathered here not to pass legal judgment," he began, "but to inquire into the matter of moral integrity, specifically the fitness of Miss Elis Winslow to hold a place of influence within the society she has, by proximity, entered." A ripple of murmurs stirred the room. Elis did not blink. Mr. Alcott continued, "Miss Winslow, you may speak in your defense." She stood slowly. The hem of her dress brushed the floor with a whisper, but her voice, when it came, was clear as glass. "I was born in a two-room house on the south edge of the city," she said. "My father worked with his hands. My mother mended clothes until her fingers bled. We didn't have books, but we had stories. We didn't have wealth, but we had pride." One of the committee men interrupted. "Miss Winslow, no one disputes your humble origins. The concern lies with your motivations." Another leaned forward. "Are you suggesting you never saw Mr. Pembroke's attention as an opportunity?" Elis turned toward him, her gaze calm. "I saw it as a danger." A few in the audience gasped. Even the stenographer paused. "I did not seek his invitation," she continued. "I did not ask for his name, nor his wealth, nor his protection. But once I became the object of his choice, the world did not ask why. It only assumed how. It assumed ambition, manipulation, seduction, not because of what I did, but because of what I was." "And what are you, Miss Winslow?" another asked, voice sharp. She let the question hang before answering. "I am a woman born without a title, who still refuses to kneel." The room fell silent. Charles closed his eyes. Mr. Alcott shuffled his papers. "There have been troubling rumors regarding your late mother's past." Elis inhaled. Her hands tightened for the briefest moment, then released. "My mother," she said slowly, "was a woman of relentless kindness. She survived war, hunger, and widowhood. She taught me to sew, to read, and to walk through this world with my head held high, even when my shoes had holes in them." She turned toward the crowd, her voice deepening with memory. "When I was 11, a boy called her a name I did not understand. My father took me to the city square and recited the words carved into the courthouse, 'All are created equal.' Then he told me that sometimes you have to remind the world of its own promises." She looked back at the committee. "So today, I remind you." In the stunned silence that followed, a single cough broke the spell. One of the merchants shifted uncomfortably. Another looked down at his notes, pretending to read what he already knew. She had dismantled their condescension not with fury, but with truth. Charles wanted to cross the room, to take her hand, to silence the sting that still burned in her words, but protocol forbade it, and dignity required patience. When the session adjourned, the city's reporters rushed to the street with pencils flying. Headlines wrote themselves before ink touched the page. "Mill Girl shames Boston's elite in unforgettable testimony. Elis Winslow, dignity in wool and fire." But inside Pembroke Manor that evening, the storm had only begun. Margaret Pembroke, dressed in silver and shadow, sat in the music room with her back straight and her expression sharper than a blade. Beatrice entered without announcement, her face pale, her eyes lit with something that had long slept beneath obedience. "You heard it, I imagine," she said. Margaret did not turn. "I read it. The city is drunk with sympathy, as if sentiment replaces breeding." Beatrice stepped closer. She has more breeding than any of us. Not by blood, by spine. Margaret's shoulders stiffened. She has tarnished our name. No, Beatrice said, her voice rising. You tarnished it. When you let the world believe that class is character, when you silenced me. Margaret turned at last. What are you talking about? Beatrice met her mother's gaze without flinching. His name was Samuel Whitaker, a painter's son. I loved him. You told me if I married him, I would be cast out. I didn't. I lost him, and I've never forgiven you, or myself. The silence that followed was colder than any snow outside. Margaret looked away. We do what we must to survive. Beatrice's voice cracked. No, we do what you demand, so you can survive. She left the room without another word. Margaret remained seated, staring into nothing. Later that night, as shadows stretched long across the great library, Charles found Elis curled on the chaise beside the window, asleep with a book open across her chest. Her breathing was soft, her hair unbound, her features lit only by the last embers of the fire. He moved quietly, not to wake her. On the side table lay an envelope, the original engagement contract, creased and forgotten. Charles picked it up, studied it for a long moment, then turned to the hearth. He fed it to the flame. The parchment curled and darkened, its elegant lies consumed in seconds. Then he sat at the desk near the window, took a fresh sheet of paper, and began to write, not as a businessman nor a suitor, but as a man stripped of pride. A letter, not of apology, but of truth. The first light of morning crept through the frost-laced panes of the boarding-house parlour, casting a pearly hush upon the modest room. Outside, the streets of Boston still slumbered under a veil of pale winter fog. Within, Elis sat curled on the faded settee, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, the edges of her journal resting on her lap. She had not slept. Her candle had long since burned out, and the cold had settled into her bones, but her thoughts had been louder than the wind scratching at the window. A knock, tentative but unmistakable, broke the silence. Elis turned, startled. No one came calling at this hour, certainly not with the reverence of that knock. She crossed the room slowly, uncertain whether to hope or steel herself. When she opened the door, she found him there, Charles Pembroke, standing not as the lion of Beacon Hill, but as a man stripped bare. His coat bore the frost of dawn, his collar undone, his eyes hollow from a sleepless night. He held a folded sheet of paper in his gloved hand. And for the first time since that wretched night at the gala, there was no arrogance in his bearing. "May I come in?" She stepped aside without speaking. He entered with the hesitance of someone stepping into a confessional, not a parlour. The door clicked shut behind them, the outside world momentarily forgotten. Charles remained standing. "I didn't come for forgiveness," he said quietly. "I don't deserve it. But there are words I need to speak, and they belong only to you." Elis remained seated. Her hands rested over the journal, concealing the violet hidden inside. She nodded once. He unfolded the paper slowly. "I wrote this last night. Not to beg, not to explain, only to reveal." His voice, when he read, trembled once and then steadied. "To Elis Winslow, you were never meant to be chosen. That was the cruelty of it. But you became the choice that dismantled me. I thought I understood power. I mistook it for control, applause, stature. I was forged in the shadow of men who measured worth by coin and lineage, by the size of their portrait frames. I learned to wear the mask they respected. And yet you, with calloused hands and fearless eyes, looked straight through it. You did not flinch when they laughed at you. You did not tremble when they whispered about me. You stood in the blaze of their disdain and did not burn. You made me see what I had forgotten, that nobility is not inherited. It is chosen every day, in silence, in truth, in dignity. And now I choose to stop pretending, not for them, for you. Charles. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense with every unshed tear, every unsaid truth, every wound newly named. Elis looked down at her journal. Her fingers moved as if of their own accord. opening to the page she had once folded and forgotten. She stood and crossed the room. Wordlessly, she placed the journal in his hands. "It's not as eloquent," she murmured, "but I wrote it the night after your business dinner. I never meant to send it. I only needed to write it." He opened the journal. Her handwriting ran across the page in ink, smudged by tears long dried, and there, between the folds, pressed like a secret too tender to name, was the violet. He read in silence. The letter was raw. It spoke of betrayal and pride, of a girl who had spent her life watching others rise while she remained invisible. It spoke of a man who had humiliated her, and who, to her great horror, had begun to matter. When he closed the journal, she was still standing before him. Their eyes met in the hush. "You kept it," he said softly, touching the edge of the violet with reverence. "It wasn't for you," she replied, voice low. "It was for the part of me I didn't want to lose." He reached out then, not with urgency, but with a tentative, open palm. She looked at his hand, then at his face. The storm behind his eyes had quieted. Her hand met his. Neither pulled away. There were no promises, no declarations. Only a long, still moment in which two people, once stranger and spectacle, now something else entirely, stood in the space between ruin and rebirth. She did not ask what came next. He did not offer certainty. But when they stepped out into the morning together, the frost gave way beneath their steps, and the city's chill seemed somehow less cruel. Possibility, like the rising sun, lit their path. The winter had softened into a hesitant spring, the kind that still clung to the bones with chill, but dared to let light touch the world once more. On the outskirts of Boston, where cobbled roads gave way to moss-covered stones and tall, bare trees reached for a sky washed in soft grey, a small stone chapel stood, quiet and unspectacular, except for what it would witness that day. Inside the chapel, every wooden pew bore witness not to aristocrats in silk cravats or powdered matriarchs with lorgnettes, but to men and women whose hands were calloused and faces weathered by labour. Mill girls wore their Sunday best, plain dresses mended with care. The air carried no scent of perfume, only lavender water and fresh starch. There were no diamonds, no titles spoken in hushed awe, and yet it was a gathering brimming with reverence. Elis stood near the altar, her dress not made of imported lace, but soft cream muslin, hand-stitched by Nora and Beatrice over quiet evenings. Her hair, pinned up simply, bore no crown or veil. Instead, tucked delicately above her ear, rested a single pressed violet, faded, fragile, eternal. Her eyes, though hesitant, held the kind of certainty born of battle. She was no longer the girl from the factory floor, nor the bewildered guest at a cruel gala. She stood as herself. Charles entered beside her, his usual stoic expression softened by something quieter, something sacred. His coat was dark, sharply tailored, yet simple, his tie knotted without flourish. He had declined every offer from tailors and family jewelers. He wanted no spectacle, only truth. The efficient, an aging clergyman with a voice like parchment, cleared his throat. Silence swept the room. Charles turned to Elis and took both her hands in his, steady, warm, trembling slightly. No vows had been written, no declarations rehearsed, only this moment. "I choose you," he said, his voice low but resonant, carrying through the wooden beams of the chapel. "With nothing to prove and everything to learn. I was raised to believe nobility could be inherited, but you taught me it must be earned." A hush. Then, slowly, a ripple of emotion passed through those gathered. Ellen Keating dabbed discreetly at her eyes with a handkerchief. Beatrice, standing just behind Elis, wore a proud smile painted with melancholy. Nora clutched her prayer book tightly, as though it might fly from her hands. When it came time to offer rings, there was no heirloom passed down, no family crest embedded in metal. Instead, Charles slipped onto Elis's finger a modest silver band, wrought by a blacksmith who once worked alongside his father. Elis, in turn, fastened around Charles's wrist a narrow strip of her mother's lace ribbon, the last piece she had saved. When the vows were sealed and the chapel door opened once more to the afternoon light, no carriages waited. Only a modest wagon, drawn by a grey mare, lent by one of the Mill families, creaked along the path to town. Elis and Charles climbed in together, hands never parting. The wagon rolled slowly toward the factory yard, the place where Elis's story had begun, in labour and shadows. Now it stood awaiting her return, not as a worker, but as something new. A large crowd had gathered, many wearing shawls against the cold, children perched on shoulders, eyes wide with wonder. On a raised wooden crate beside the great brick wall, Elis stood before them, her voice rising clear into the air. "This was never my plan. I never dreamed of this, not fame, not fortune. But I did dream of dignity, of the right to learn, of the right to be more than a machine." Murmurs spread, soft and swelling. "Today," she continued, her hand brushing the violet at her neckline, "I announce the founding of the Elis Winslow School for Working Girls, in memory of my mother, who taught me that the mind is not the luxury of the rich. It is the birthright of every soul." Cheers erupted. The crowd surged forward, not to touch her gown, but to thank her, to see themselves in her, to believe. Charles stood at the edge, hands in his pockets, watching her. He had once brought her to this world, on a whim, for pride, for vengeance, and yet here she stood, not beside him but above the ridicule, above the gossip, above the glass ceiling that had sought to press her down. She descended from the crate and found him waiting. He extended his hand, not with pomp, not as a rescuer or a conqueror, but as a companion, a partner, a man who had been changed. Elis took it without hesitation. Their hands, once so hesitant, now intertwined with ease, moved together as they walked back through the gates, surrounded by cheers, by sawdust and soot, by bells chiming faintly in the harbour air. It was not a grand parade, nor a royal coronation. It was something purer. A mockery had brought them together. But it was love and the courage to defy what the world expected that made them noble. The snow had long since melted from the rooftops of Boston, but the scent of lilac still carried the memory of the spring when everything had changed. 6 years had passed since the quiet wedding in the stone chapel, and yet even now, some still whispered about it in parlours gilded with fading glory. They whispered of the mill girl who had become a magnate's wife, not through scandal nor scheming, but by standing her ground when the world tried to trample her spirit. Elis Pembroke, still Winslow to the girls who lined up at the school she founded, walked the corridors of that same school each morning, her boots dusted with chalk, her sleeves rolled as she helped rearrange desks or mend hems torn in play. The building stood beside the Pembroke Mill, where new policies now ensured education, fair wages, and maternity leave. What had once been a symbol of industrial conquest had become a haven, and Elis had insisted on it bearing her mother's name, the Violet School for Working Girls. Charles remained by her side, his posture less rigid now, his voice softer, though his mind was still sharp as a blade. He no longer attended the grand dinners of Boston's elite. Instead, he spent evenings reading beside his wife in their modest parlour, or helping the school's older girls learn accounting. The city still referred to him as a magnate, but those who knew him simply called him the man who finally found his dignity. He had traded ambition for legacy, and never looked back. They had 2 children, a boy named Elias, with Elis's quiet gaze and Charles's stubborn jaw, and a girl called Clara, born with lungs that could outcry any street vendor. When Elis watched them play in the garden behind the school, where violets bloomed wildly now each spring, she would sometimes close her eyes and see her mother's hands gently guiding her sewing, tucking flowers into her braids. The circle had not broken. It had simply expanded. Beatrice never married. She claimed it was by choice, but Elis suspected otherwise. The quiet sadness in Beatrice's eyes had lessened over the years as she poured her heart into social reform alongside Elis, challenging outdated rules from within. Together, they had become voices that noblewomen could not ignore. Ellen Keating remained the soul of the Pembroke home, though she spent more and more time at the school, teaching etiquette and kindness in equal measure. The younger girls adored her, particularly for the toffees she always carried in her apron, and the way she sang lullabies in Irish when no one else was watching. As for Margaret Pembroke, she never returned to Boston. She settled instead in a villa along the coast of Maine, sending Christmas cards each year without fail, and once a silver locket for Clara's christening. Her pride had not broken, but softened, as if the sea winds had worn it down. Edwin Hargrave had not been so lucky. After a failed attempt to wrest control of a shipping empire, he vanished from society circles entirely. Some claimed he fled to London. Others whispered of bankruptcy or disgrace. No one missed him, not really. And Boston too had changed, slowly, painfully, but it had changed. The girls who once stood in factory lines now walked into classrooms. Wages had shifted, opportunities expanded, and the name Winslow no longer caused laughter in the salons of Beacon Hill. It inspired nods of respect. On the 6th anniversary of their wedding, Elis and Charles returned to the chapel at dusk. It was empty, save for the scent of rain and the hush of violets blooming in the grass outside. He took her hand, as he had once done before an uncertain future, and kissed her knuckles, one by one. "I chose you," he said again, "with nothing to prove, and everything to be grateful for." Elis did not cry, though her heart swelled with the weight of all they had survived. She pressed a fresh violet into the pages of her old journal, its spine now worn, its pages filled with the story of how she became more than a symbol, more than a bride, more than a mockery. She had become a woman who changed the world by refusing to let it change her, and beside her stood the man who had once worn a mask, and now bore only truth. Their story had begun in humiliation, but it endured in love, and that, Elis believed, was the noblest ending of all. Sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with thunder, but with a quiet refusal to be silenced. Elis Winslow was never meant to stand at the center of Boston society. She was mocked, used, discarded by a world that believed power belonged to the polished, the privileged, the pedigreed. But she rose, not because she sought revenge, but because she carried dignity like a flame in her chest. She turned mockery into movement, silence into strength, and a pressed violet into a symbol of all that cannot be bought or broken. This story reminds us that true nobility isn't found in titles, fortunes, or the admiration of strangers. It lives in those who dare to walk forward with trembling hands and steady hearts. In a world quick to judge, may we remember the quiet ones, those like Elis, who changed everything simply by refusing to become someone else's pawn. If you reach the end of this journey, write the word Violet in the comments. That way, we'll know you stood with her, through the storms, the slander, and the love that bloomed from unlikely soil. If this story touched you, and you'd like to help us bring more tales like this to life, you can leave a super thanks with whatever amount your heart allows. Every contribution, big or small, helps our team continue creating these emotional, dramatic period romances. And if a donation isn't possible right now, sharing this video with a friend who loves historical stories is a beautiful way to support us. Don't forget to explore the other unforgettable love stories I've left for you in the video cards. Thank you for watching, and for believing, like Elis, that a woman's story is never too small to matter.